before the first missile crossed the Durand Line, before the first smoke column rose above Paktika's ridgelines, before a Pakistani prime minister stood at a podium and used the word crushing reference to men who once received Islamabad's blessing, there was a map. Study that map carefully. It does not show you two countries separated by a border. It shows you two governments divided by the same war, tangled in the same ideology, bleeding from the same wound, and pointing the same accusation in opposite directions. The moment that map became a death sentence for thousands of civilians in eastern Afghanistan happened not in 2024, not in 2023. It happened in 1947, when the British departed and left behind a line drawn in colonial ink across terrain that had never consented to borders. Every strike that followed was, in some sense, that ink being paid for in blood. But we begin not with history. We begin with a specific night. March 2025, the Kunar Valley, a compound dark against darker mountains. Inside it, according to Pakistani military intelligence, a command cell of the Taliban. Pakistan, the TTP, was conducting operational planning for attacks against Pakistani soil. Men who had crossed from Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, trained in Afghan territory, been hosted by a government that Pakistan had co-created through decades of strategic calculation, were now preparing to dismember the state that had built them. The missiles arrived before dawn. By the time the sun cleared the Hindu Kush, Pakistan's Inter-Services Public Relations was releasing a terse, precise statement. Targets neutralized. High-value operatives eliminated. Pakistan's right to self-defense exercised under international law. In Kabul, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan issued its own statement. What Pakistan had struck, the Taliban government said, was not a terrorist compound, it was a village. The dead were not operatives. They were families. Two statements. One smoking crater, and between them, a question that the 21st century has not yet found the vocabulary to answer. At what point does a patron state become an enemy of its own creation? To understand the operational geometry of this crisis, you must first understand what Pakistan built along its western frontier over the course of 4 decades, and why that architecture of influence became the most dangerous structure Pakistan ever erected. The Durand Line runs for approximately 2,670 kilometers, stretching from the edge of Chinese-controlled territory in the north to the border with Iran in the south. It bisects the Pashtun tribal belt, a population that has never, in any meaningful cultural or political sense, recognized the line as legitimate. On both sides of it, the same families, the same language, the same grievances, the same memory of who armed them and who abandoned them. Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, the EC, cultivated the Afghan Taliban as a strategic instrument beginning in the early 1990s. The logic was clean in Rawalpindi-esque briefing rooms. A Taliban-controlled Afghanistan would provide Pakistan's strategic depth against India, eliminate Indian influence in Kabul, and create a pliant neighbor that would never contest the Durand Line's legitimacy. For decades, this calculation appeared to hold. Afghan Taliban fighters trained in Pakistani madrasas. Pakistani logistics supported Taliban operations. When the Taliban fell in 2001, their leadership sheltered in Quetta and Peshawar with varying degrees of Pakistani complicity. It was a masterwork of proxy architecture, until the instrument turned on the hand that held it. The TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, emerged as a distinct organization in 2007, drawing ideological sustenance from the Afghan Taliban but directing its violence inward toward the Pakistani state. From the bombing of the Army Public School in Peshawar in 2014, which killed 149 children and etched permanent grief into Pakistan's national consciousness, to the sustained campaign of suicide attacks against police stations, military checkpoints, and civilian markets across Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the TTP had extracted an extraordinary toll. By 2024, Pakistan's government estimated that TTP attacks had killed over 80,000 Pakistani civilians and security personnel since 2007. The economic damage ran into the hundreds of billions. The political cost, the erosion of state authority in the tribal belt, the displacement of millions, was incalculable. And all of it, Pakistan's generals insisted, was being facilitated from across a border they could see but could not, under the previous strategic arrangement, Cross. The Afghan Taliban's return to power in August 2021 had been greeted in some Pakistani circles with quiet satisfaction. The Americans were gone. Indian influence in Kabul had been severed. The long game appeared to have paid out. It took approximately 18 months for that calculation to disintegrate. The Taliban government in Kabul refused to suppress the TTP. Pakistani requests, then demands, then ultimatums produced only diplomatic evasion. The Taliban's position was, if not publicly stated, operationally clear. The TTP were fellow travelers, ideological siblings, men who had fought the same infidel occupation. Handing them to Pakistan would be a betrayal of movement solidarity that the Taliban's own rank and file would not accept. Pakistan found itself trapped inside its own strategic logic. It had spent decades insisting that Afghanistan must not become a base for anti-Pakistan activity, while simultaneously cultivating the very movement that was now hosting anti-Pakistan militants. It had argued that Afghan sovereignty must not be violated, while running operations inside Afghan territory for 40 years. It had demanded the Taliban be recognized as a legitimate government. While the Taliban government openly sheltered its enemies, the trap was elegant in its irony. By 2023, Pakistani military planners had begun drafting what would become a fundamentally different approach. Not diplomacy, not proxy leverage. Direct kinetic action, airstrikes, artillery, and special operations raids across the Durand Line against TTP positions inside Afghanistan. The doctrine had a name inside GHQ Rawalpindi. It was called, with characteristic military understatement, cross-border precision engagement. History would call it something else entirely. To appreciate the strategic weight of this decision, consider what Pakistani military planners were accepting when they authorized cross-border strikes. They were accepting that the Afghan Taliban, an organization whose international recognition Pakistan had lobbied for, whose sanctions relief Pakistan had championed, whose government Pakistan had been among the first to engage diplomatically, would now become, in operational terms, an adversary. They were accepting that every strike on Afghan soil would be a propaganda gift to the Taliban government, which could present Pakistani missiles killing Afghan civilians as proof of Pakistani imperialism. They were accepting that any Pakistani military action inside Afghanistan risked radicalizing precisely the Pashtun border communities whose loyalty Pakistan had spent decades trying to secure. They were accepting, most dangerously, that there was no defined endpoint, no political objective whose achievement would allow Pakistan to declare victory and withdraw. No territory to hold, no government to install, no treaty to sign. They were accepting a war with no exit architecture. This is the cold geometry of the crisis as it stood in early 2025. Not a war of choice, Pakistan's commanders would argue. A war of necessity. A calculation that the cost of inaction, continued TTP attacks degrading Pakistani state authority in its own territory, exceeded the cost of action, however open-ended and operationally uncertain. That argument has a logic to it. It also has the same logic that has ended empires. The Pakistani armed forces bring to this conflict one of the larger and more operationally experienced militaries in the world. An active force of approximately 654,000 personnel. An air force equipped with F-16 Fighting Falcons, JF-17 Thunder multi-role fighters, and Chinese-supplied J-10C aircraft, the latter a significant upgrade in capability, that had entered service only in 2022. An artillery corps with extended-range rocket systems capable of reaching targets 70 to 150 kilometers beyond the frontier. Special Operations Forces, SSG, the Special Services Group, with decades of experience in exactly the terrain type that dominates the Afghan-Pakistani border. Against this, the Taliban government commands forces of uncertain but substantial number. The Afghan National Army collapsed in 2021, but its former equipment, American-supplied vehicles, helicopters, some artillery, was partially absorbed into Taliban formations. Taliban fighters are not a conventional army. They are an insurgency that has governed. Their strength is not in combined arms operations or air power, of which they have essentially none in serviceable condition. Their strength is in what it has always been: terrain, knowledge, population, embeddedness, patience, and the political cost they can impose on any attacker. Pakistan possesses overwhelming firepower. Afghanistan possesses overwhelming geography. And between those two asymmetric advantages, the Kunar Valley waits. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif's statement, delivered to Pakistan's parliament and broadcast across a nation that had grown exhausted by TTP violence, was specific in its ambition and general in its method. Pakistan's forces, the Prime Minister said, were ready to crush the terrorists wherever they sheltered. The word crush entered the strategic vocabulary of this crisis and did not leave. It implied finality, it implied capacity, it implied a political will to sustain military action until an endpoint undefined, perhaps indefinable, was reached. It also, to those who study the history of states that have used that word in relation to guerrilla movements, implied something else: overconfidence. Not in the military instrument itself, which was real and capable and had been honed by decades of counterinsurgency experience, but in the political theory underneath the military action. The idea that aerial bombardment and cross-border strikes could solve a problem that had its roots not in geography but in ideology, in governance failure and poverty, in the unresolved question of what the Pashtun tribal belt owes to states, it has never fully accepted. Steel can destroy a compound. It cannot destroy a grievance. As Pakistani strike aircraft banked over the mountains and Pakistani artillery tubes elevated their barrels toward coordinates in Kunar and Khost and Paktika, something that had been building for 40 years reached its operational expression. The patron had become the pursuer, the sanctuary had become the target, and the border that had never been legitimate, drawn by men who never walked its terrain, enforced by governments that had violated it whenever convenient, that border was about to become the center of gravity of a conflict whose second-order consequences no intelligence agency in the region had fully mapped. The next segment of this story belongs to the aircraft and the men who flew them. It belongs to the strike packages, the target folders, the battle damage assessment reports. It belongs to the operational design of a campaign that Pakistan's military planners believed, with documented sincerity, could be both surgical and decisive. That belief was about to encounter terrain. And terrain in this part of the world has never lost. There is a particular problem that modern air power has never solved, and it is not technological. It is epistemological. You can strike a coordinate with extraordinary precision, sub-meter accuracy. A missile that travels 300 kilometers and arrives within 2 meters of the intended point of detonation. The problem is not the precision of the strike. The problem is the precision of the intelligence. Because before the weapon arrives, someone must decide what the weapon is aimed at. Someone must produce a folder, a target package, that identifies the physical location of a human being or an organizational node worth the political, financial, and moral cost of the weapon. And that intelligence production chain, from source to analyst to planner to pilot to impact, is where every aerial campaign in human history has broken down. Pakistan's campaign against TTP positions inside Afghanistan was designed, according to military briefings that filtered through Pakistani media, as a precision counterterrorism operation. Not a campaign against the Taliban government per se, not a territorial seizure, a systematic targeting of TTP command and control nodes, training infrastructure, logistics supply points, and, most ambitiously, the movement and communication patterns of specific high-value individuals. The theory was impeccable. The execution entered what military planners call the friction zone almost immediately. Pakistan's air campaign drew on 3 primary strike platforms. The JF-17 Thunder, the multi-role fighter developed jointly with China, formed the backbone of strike missions. In its Block 3 variant, the version operational with Pakistan, Air Force squadrons by 2023, the JF-17 carries an active electronically scanned array radar, beyond visual range air-to-air missiles and a strike loadout capability that includes GPS and laser-guided munitions with a standoff range sufficient to prosecute targets from Pakistani airspace. This was operationally significant. It allowed strike aircraft to release weapons without fully penetrating Afghan air defense envelope, which, while limited, was not negligible given the Taliban's acquisition of former ANSF air defense systems. The F-16, Pakistan's most capable platform for complex strike missions with time-sensitive targeting requirements, was employed selectively. The Americans, who supplied and maintained Pakistan's F-16 fleet under end-user agreement restrictions, had not formally endorsed the use of these aircraft against targets in Afghanistan. The political geometry of that constraint shaped mission planning in ways that Pakistani planners did not advertise but operational analysts could infer from the pattern of reported strikes. Pakistan's Shaheen and Gids medium-range rockets, combined with BM-21 Grad and A-100 multiple rocket launcher systems, provided artillery-based fires for targets within range of forward-deployed Pakistani army positions in Bajaur, Dir and Khyber districts. These systems offered persistence and volume that strike aircraft could not, the ability to place sustained fire on a target area, or to rapidly service multiple targets across a broader frontage than a finite number of aircraft sorties could cover. And then there were the drones. Pakistan's Barak-armed unmanned aerial vehicle and its more capable successor platforms had been operational against domestic TTP targets since 2015. Their extension into Afghan territory represented both a tactical capability and a political signal that Pakistan was willing to operate persistently, not just in single-strike events. Inside Afghan airspace, the target folders for the initial strike packages required intelligence that Pakistan had been accumulating through multiple collection streams for approximately 2 years before the March 2025 strikes. Human intelligence, from cross-border informant networks that Pakistani intelligence maintained within the Afghan Pashtun tribal communities. The density and reliability of this network varied enormously by district. In some areas, particularly in Kunar and Nuristan, where cross-border family and tribal ties were most dense, Pakistani intelligence had relatively robust access. In others, particularly in the interior provinces where Taliban social control was tighter, the network was thin, outdated, and vulnerable to deliberate deception. Signals intelligence is again drawn from monitoring of communications channels used by TTP operational cells. The TTP, like most mature insurgent organizations, had adapted its communications security substantially since 2007. Use of encrypted messaging platforms, strict communication discipline, courier-based command traffic for the most sensitive operational planning. These practices degraded Pakistan's SIGINT picture significantly. Imagery intelligence, INT from both satellite and airborne collection platforms, including persistent surveillance of identified compound complexes in Kunar-Sarkani, Chowke, and Narang districts where Pakistani intelligence assessed. TTP infrastructure was concentrated. The synthesis of these streams produced target packages of varying confidence. Some were assessed with high probability, specific compounds used consistently for specific functions, confirming multiple collection sources over extended observation periods. Others were assessed at lower confidence, flagged as probable or likely TTP infrastructure in language that, in the briefing room, sounds like professional caution, and on the ground, when the weapon impacts, sounds like a reason someone's family died for nothing. The first wave of strikes in the March 2025 operation hit 8 primary targets across 3 districts. In Kunar and Paktika provinces, the selection logic was layered. Priority 1, communications and command nodes. Priority 2, training complexes. Priority 3, weapon storage and logistics facilities. The intent was to disrupt the TTP's ability to plan and execute attacks against Pakistan over a 90 to 180 day horizon, to degrade operational tempo, force a dispersal of command structures, and impose replacement costs on the organization's leadership cadre, Pakistani military. Briefings in the aftermath claimed a significant number of militants killed in the strikes. The number shifted through multiple iterations of official communication, As numbers in military briefings tend to do, the Taliban government in Kabul released its own assessment within hours. The dead, Kabul said, were not militants. They included women and children. This was not simply a propaganda counter-narrative. Several journalists who reached the strike sites within 72 hours reported finding the physical evidence of residential occupation, cooking implements, children's clothing, domestic animals, the architectural details of family compounds rather than the operational geometry of military facilities. The intelligence picture had been, in some instances, wrong. This was not exceptional. It was the rule. Every air campaign in the modern era has produced this discrepancy between the target folder and the ground truth. The gap between what intelligence says a building contains and what a building actually contains on the night a weapon arrives is one of the fundamental, unresolved problems of 21st century warfare. Pakistan's military, to its credit, did not pretend the problem didn't exist. It acknowledged in carefully worded statements that all necessary precautions were taken to minimize civilian casualties. That language is specific. It is also, to anyone who has studied the juridical and operational meaning of military necessity and proportionality in the laws of armed conflict, not quite an admission and not quite a denial. The Taliban's response to the strikes was immediate, multi-dimensional and operationally sophisticated. Within 24 hours of the initial Pakistani strikes, Taliban forces in the border districts had deployed additional infantry units to forward positions along the Durand Line. This was not a preparation for a conventional cross-border offensive. Taliban commanders were not suicidal. Pakistan's army maintained substantial forward positions and heavy weapon superiority in any conventional engagement along the frontier. But the Taliban's forward deployment served multiple purposes simultaneously. It demonstrated resolve to a domestic Afghan audience that was outraged by the strikes and demanding a response. It created tactical ambiguity for Pakistani commanders, who now had to devote collection assets to monitoring Taliban force disposition rather than exclusively focusing those assets on TTP targeting, and it raised the political temperature in a way that complicated Pakistani decision-making about follow-on strikes. A Pakistani strike that killed Taliban soldiers who had demonstrably deployed to a border position was a fundamentally different political event than a strike against a TTP compound in a mountain valley. The Taliban had moved a piece onto the board that changed the character of the game. Across the border in Pakistan's tribal belt, the TTP's own operational response began to manifest within weeks. TTP commanders who had been operating from the struck districts dispersed, as any competent adversary would, to pre-identified alternate locations. The organizational resilience of the TTP reflected 40 years of hardening under exactly the kind of pressure Pakistan was now applying, albeit from the Pakistani side rather than the American side. TTP cells that had been using communication systems identified by Pakistani SIGINT went dark and re-established contact on new channels. Command structures that had been geographically concentrated dispersed into smaller, more survivable nodes. The strikes had imposed costs. Genuine costs. The death of experienced operational planners. The destruction of physical infrastructure. The disruption of logistics chains, but the TTP did not collapse. It adapted, and in adapting, it demonstrated the central tactical problem of Pakistan's approach. The campaign was designed to degrade a network, but networks do not die at the speed of steel. They die, if they die at all, at the speed of ideas, and Pakistan had brought no weapon capable of firing at that target. In Rawalpindi, Pakistani military planners were processing battle damage assessment with the unsentimental precision of professionals. Some assessments were satisfying. Confirmed kills of named individuals who had appeared on target folders. Destruction of physical infrastructure that would require months to replace. Documented disruption of TTP attack planning cycles, evidenced by a measurable decline in attempted infiltrations into Pakistani territory in the 30-day window following the strikes. Other assessments were uncomfortable. The civilian casualty reports, the diplomatic fallout which had been anticipated but whose intensity exceeded modeling, the Taliban's forward deployment, which had required a recalibration of Pakistani force posture along sections of the frontier that had previously been lower priority, and, most troublingly, the intelligence gaps that the post-strike analysis was revealing. Several targets that had been assessed as high-confidence TTP infrastructure turned out, upon post-strike analysis of imagery and ground reporting, to have been vacated days before the strikes. Either Pakistani collection had been compromised, someone inside the intelligence chain had warned TTP commanders, or the TTP's own operational security had been sophisticated enough to cycle through positions frequently enough that intelligence picture was chronically outdated. Both possibilities were serious. One of them was terrifying. There is a concept in operational design called culmination point. It refers to the moment in an offensive operation at which the attacking force can no longer sustain the momentum of its advance, when logistics are strained, forces are exhausted, and the cost of continuing exceeds the gain. Pakistani planners, studying their campaign results at the 45-day mark, were asking themselves a question that military planners always hate to ask: had the strikes achieved a strategic effect proportionate to their political and operational cost? The honest answer, which would not appear in official statements, was probably not yet. Possibly never, if the theory of victory underlying the campaign, that kinetic strikes could degrade TTP operational capability to the point of strategic irrelevance, was itself flawed. That question sat in the air of Rawalpindi's planning rooms like humidity before a monsoon. Something was building. The next act of this conflict would not belong to strike planners and target analysts. It would belong to the border, to the terrain, to the 2,670 kilometers of unresolvable geography that had been generating its own logic since long before Pakistan existed as a state. There is a ridge in Kunar province, unnamed on most maps, unremarkable in satellite imagery, barely distinguishable from the hundreds of ridgelines that corrugated the landscape between the Kunar River and the Pakistani border, that the Taliban understood before Pakistani planners had finished drawing their target folders. It commands 3 approach routes simultaneously. From that ridge, a handful of fighters with heavy machine guns and mortar could make the passage of a battalion strength force an exercise in organized hemorrhage, not stop it, not destroy it, but make it cost enough and take enough time that every strategic calculation made in an air-conditioned operations room in Rawalpindi would have to be revised. The Taliban had been studying ridgelines like this since before most of Pakistan's current general officers had graduated from the Pakistan Military Academy at Kabul. This is the fundamental operational problem that Pakistan now faced as its campaign expanded beyond its initial air-centric phase. Pakistani ground operations along the Durand Line in 2024 and 2025 involved a substantial escalation in the tempo and depth of frontier security activities. Beyond the airstrikes that drew international attention, Pakistani army units were conducting cross-border raids, short duration, small unit actions intended to destroy specific TTP infrastructure and disrupt logistics routes in the tribal districts that abutted Kunar, Khost, and Paktika. These operations drew on the Pakistani Army's Frontier Corps, the paramilitary organization that had operated in the tribal belt for a century, and on regular Army infantry battalions specifically trained for high-altitude counterinsurgency. The SSG Special Services Group provided the direct action capability for the highest value target raids. The SSG is a genuinely elite force. Small in number, rigorously selected, trained to a standard that Pakistani military authorities and independent military analysts who have assessed them describe as legitimately world-class for its specific operational environment. In the terrain of the Pak-Afghan border, altitudes above 3,000 meters, extreme temperature variation, limited resupply options, broken terrain that makes radio communication unreliable and air support difficult to vector accurately, The SSG had accumulated irreplaceable operational experience. But even elite forces operate within the laws of physics. And the physics of the Kunar Valley had been writing its own operational manual for millennia. The Taliban's response to Pakistani ground probes was studied, calibrated, and deliberately designed to impose the maximum cost at the minimum commitment. Taliban commanders in the border districts understood, with professional clarity, that a symmetrical defense against Pakistani regular forces was a death sentence for their units. Pakistani artillery superiority, air support, night vision capability, and logistics depth made any static engagement suicidal for Taliban formations holding a fixed position. So the Taliban didn't fight Pakistani forces symmetrically. They fought them the way the Taliban had always fought, with the terrain as the primary weapon and the fighter as the secondary one. Pakistani units moving into Afghan territory on raid operations found approach routes that appeared passable on imagery, but proved on the ground to be two-day movements through terrain that gave every advantage to a defender who knew every fold of it. They found compounds vacated hours before arrival, sometimes so recently that cooking fires were still warm, a detail that intelligence officers in Rawalpindi found deeply disturbing for what it implied about the permeability of Pakistani operational security. They found IEDs on the most logical approach routes, placed not in large numbers, but with exceptional precision, enough to slow movement, force route clearance, and compress the operational timeline of a raid from hours to days. And they found, occasionally, the Taliban's version of fire and movement, a brief, violent ambush from a prepared position, intense enough to force Pakistani units to deploy and return fire, and then a total disengagement before Pakistani supporting arms could be brought to bear. The Taliban fighter who ambushed a Pakistani patrol and then disappeared into the mountain had, in operational terms, won, not because he destroyed anything of decisive value, but because he consumed Pakistani time, Pakistani ammunition, Pakistani medical resources, and above all, Pakistani certainty, the confidence of an advancing force that its operational design is functioning, is as much a logistical resource as ammunition. When it degrades, operational tempo degrades with it. The civilian dimension of this campaign was metastasizing in ways that Pakistani planners had underestimated. Every Pakistani airstrike that produced civilian casualties, and there were multiple documented instances, was not simply a humanitarian tragedy. It was a strategic event of significant consequence. In the Pashtun tribal communities of the Afghan-Pakistani border, where the concept of Badal, obligatory revenge, is not a cultural curiosity, but a binding social contract, the death of a civilian at Pakistani hands created obligations, not just in Afghanistan, not just in the Taliban, but in extended family networks that stretched across the Durand Line and into Khyber Pakhtunkhwa itself. Pakistani commanders understood this dynamic theoretically. They had written about it in counterinsurgency doctrines, studied it in the context of the American campaign, analyzed it in the Pakistani tribal belt's own history. Understanding a dynamic theoretically and managing it operationally are two entirely different cognitive exercises, the flow of Taliban sympathizers, and of men driven by Badal rather than ideology, into TTP recruitment pipelines in the weeks following major strike events was measurable. Pakistani military intelligence tracked it. The tracking confirmed what doctrine predicted: kinetic action against a networked population-embedded organization, when it generates civilian casualties, can produce more adversaries than it eliminates. The strikes were creating the conditions for their own failure. In Kabul, the Taliban government was navigating its own operational crisis with a precision that suggested considerable institutional sophistication. The IEA Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan faced a structural dilemma. It was ideologically and organizationally bound to the TTP. Suppressing the TTP would require the Taliban to turn its weapons on men who were, by every measure that mattered in Taliban political culture, brothers. Men who had fought the same enemy, men whose commanders sat at the same tables, men whose families were intertwined by marriage, and movement across the same tribal geography. But allowing Pakistan to strike Afghan soil without meaningful response risked something equally dangerous: the perception that the Taliban government was incapable of defending Afghan sovereignty. In a political culture where credibility depends on demonstrated willingness to fight, the appearance of passivity under Pakistani strikes was corrosive to the Taliban's legitimacy. The Taliban's resolution to this dilemma was elegant in its operational efficiency. They did not fight Pakistan directly. They did not mobilize for conventional cross-border operations that Pakistan's military superiority would have turned into a catastrophe. They did not suppress the TTP, which would have been a domestic political catastrophe. Instead, they allowed, and in some documented cases facilitated, the TTP's operational adaptation to Pakistani strikes. They provided the territorial depth, the logistical infrastructure, and the sanctuary that enabled TTP cells disrupted by Pakistani action to reconstitute elsewhere. They managed the information environment, publicizing civilian casualties, positioning themselves internationally as victims of Pakistani aggression with media sophistication that several regional analysts found surprising for an organization better known for destruction than communication. The Taliban were winning the information campaign while fighting no conventional battle. Pakistan's military found itself in an operational posture that had a historical precedent, and that precedent was not encouraging. The precedent was the American experience in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2021, a militarily dominant external power conducting precision strikes against a networked, terrain-embedded, population-backed adversary. A campaign designed to degrade a specific organization that kept reconstituting. An operational approach that generated civilian casualties, which generated new adversaries, which required more strikes, which generated more civilian casualties in a loop that showed no mathematical path to resolution. Pakistani generals did not appreciate this comparison. They pointed, with justified irritation, to the fundamental difference. Pakistan was not an occupying power. Pakistan was a neighboring state defending itself against cross-border attacks. Pakistan had an exit. It was already home. It didn't need to hold Afghan territory. It needed only to make Afghan territory too costly for the TTP to use freely. The argument had merit. It also had a flaw. The flaw was that the TTP's ability to use Afghan territory depended not only on the TTP's willingness to accept the cost of Pakistani strikes, but on the Taliban government's tolerance of TTP presence. And the Taliban's tolerance of TTP presence was not going to be altered by Pakistani airstrikes. It might in fact be hardened by them. The military instrument was being applied to a problem that the military instrument could not solve. Rawalpindi knew this. It struck. Anyway, because the alternative, accepting an ongoing TTP campaign against Pakistani civilians and soldiers without visible response, was, in the political arithmetic of a Pakistani government facing elections and a military facing questions about its institutional competence, not operationally acceptable. Sometimes states go to war not because war is likely to work, but because the political cost of not going to war is higher than the strategic cost of going to war and failing. This is not cynicism. It is the grammar of statcraft. By the summer of 2025, Pakistani military operations along the Afghan frontier had entered a phase that operational analysts describe with a specific and sobering term: strategic stalemate with escalatory pressure. Translation: neither side was winning. Both sides were escalating, and the escalation was producing costs that exceeded the gains for both parties, while removing the political space that might have permitted a negotiated pause. What happened next did not happen on a battlefield. It happened in the logic of institutions under pressure. The internal Pakistani military debate in this period was not between hawks and doves. It was between two different theories of escalation. The first theory argued for deeper strikes, the extension of the target set beyond TTP infrastructure to include Taliban military facilities that were demonstrably supporting TTP operations. The logic was compelling in the briefing room. If Taliban forces were providing logistics, communications and territorial sanctuary to the TTP, then Taliban military infrastructure was a legitimate target under any reasonable interpretation of the laws of armed conflict. Striking Taliban military assets would impose a cost directly on the organization providing TTP cover, and would signal a willingness to escalate that might, theoretically, alter Taliban calculations. The second theory argued for restraint, a pause in kinetic operations combined with a diplomatic offensive, engaging Taliban interlocutors through Chinese and Qatari channels with a specific, verifiable demand set, expel TTP senior leadership, deny TTP access to Taliban-controlled logistics networks, cooperate on cross-border intelligence sharing. Backed by the credible threat of resummist strikes, this approach might extract behavioral change without the escalatory risks of striking Taliban forces directly. Both theories had advocates. Both had substantive arguments. Neither could demonstrate a historical precedent for success. In this specific operational context, the Taliban's tactical escalation along the Durand Line reached its first critical threshold in late spring. Taliban frontier forces, now significantly reinforced from interior provinces, began conducting what could only be described as calibrated harassment operations. Not full-scale attacks on Pakistani frontier posts. Not the kind of engagement that would trigger a Pakistani response of overwhelming force, but persistent, low-intensity pressure, sniper fire on Pakistani positions from Afghan territory, occasional rocket attacks on Pakistani border outposts, and most destabilizing of all, the systematic emplacement of IEDs on Pakistani patrol routes that ran close enough to the Durand Line that questions of territorial attribution were deliberately ambiguous. Was the IED placed by TTP fighters operating from Afghan territory? By Taliban fighters who retained plausible deniability? By local commanders acting on personal initiative? By a coordinated Taliban policy designed to impose costs without provoking a Pakistani response of disproportionate scale? Pakistani intelligence was not always certain. This uncertainty was itself the Taliban's most effective weapon. Fog of war is not merely a tactical phenomenon. It is a strategic instrument deployed deliberately by a sophisticated adversary to paralyze the decision-making of a more powerful opponent, Pakistani public opinion, a force that Pakistani military commanders had historically been able to manage with more control than their civilian counterparts, was fracturing along fault lines that the crisis was exposing rather than creating. In Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where the TTP threat was most viscerally felt, where police officers attended their colleagues' funerals with the numbed regularity of men who had long since run out of grief, there was broad popular support for military action in Afghanistan. The sentiment was specific and personal: stop the attacks, no matter what it takes. But in the Pashtun tribal communities of Fatah and KP, where family networks ran unbroken across the Durand Line, where a cousin in Kunar was as familiar a figure as a neighbor in Peshawar, the strikes were experienced not as counterterrorism but as Pakistani bombs falling on Pashtun families. The distinction between TTP fighter and Afghan civilian, clear in Rawalpindi's target folders, was not clear, could not be made clear, to a family who attended the funeral of relatives killed in a strike that the military insisted was precise and the family knew had killed their children. This fracture in Pashtun political sentiment between the demand for security from TTP attacks and the outrage at Pakistani strikes killing Pashtun civilians across the border was not a manageable public relations problem. It was a structural fault line in Pakistan's internal politics that the campaign was widening with every strike. Pakistani political parties, sensing the electoral topography of this fault line, were adjusting their positions with the practiced agility of organizations that had survived decades of political earthquakes. Some were moving toward an aggressive nationalist posture, standing with the military, demanding harder action. Others were moving toward a Pashtun nationalist critique, positioning themselves as defenders of Pashtun communities against a military campaign they characterized as disproportionate and strategically illiterate, the Prime Minister's office was watching all of this with the focused anxiety of a government that had used the word crush at a moment of public outrage and was now discovering that the vocabulary of certainty creates expectations that the mathematics of counterinsurgency cannot always meet. Iran entered the periphery of this crisis in ways that amplified its complexity without resolving any of its dimensions. Iran's relationship with the Taliban, complex, instrumentalized, historically adversarial but pragmatically managed, had produced in the post-2021 period a grudging working arrangement. Iran disliked the Taliban ideologically. It feared Taliban Sunni radicalism. It had watched with alarm as the Taliban's consolidation of power had produced a humanitarian catastrophe that was driving Afghan refugee flows toward Iranian territory in volumes that Iran's economy and political system could not absorb, but Iran also disliked. Pakistani influence in Afghanistan and Pakistan's military campaign, if it created a prolonged Afghan crisis, might, in Tehran's calculation, do useful things to Pakistani regional position while consuming Pakistani military resources that might otherwise be directed toward Pakistan's western border, a direction that had Iranian security implications. Iran did not intervene, but Tehran's quiet signals to Taliban leadership that Iran understood the Taliban's need to resist Pakistani strikes and would not obstruct Taliban military actions against Pakistan in the border regions altered the strategic context in ways that Pakistani planners could not formally acknowledge but could not ignore. A multi-front adversarial dynamic was crystallizing around Pakistan with the slow inevitability of a strategic trap. In Paktika province, a specific operational event crystallized the nature of the spiral that Pakistan had entered. A Pakistani strike, assessed by military intelligence as targeting a TTP logistics node, hit a compound that subsequent investigation conducted by UN monitors and independent Afghan journalists identified as containing a Taliban district administration office. Afghan officials were killed. Taliban fighters were killed. And again, civilians were killed. The Taliban response to this strike was qualitatively different from previous responses. For the first time, Taliban military commanders publicly announced that Afghan forces had the right to respond to Pakistani aggression with force. The word right was specific. It was a legal and political claim. It was the Taliban inserting itself into the conflict not as a passive host of TTP sanctuary, but as an active party with its own military legal posture. This was escalation, deliberate, calibrated, and potentially irreversible. Pakistani military planners stared at the intelligence report of this statement with the specific alertness of professionals who recognize when a threshold has been crossed. For months, the operational fiction maintained by both sides for reasons of political convenience had been that Pakistani strikes were against TTP, not Taliban, that the Taliban and Pakistani forces were not formally in a state of conflict, that diplomatic channels remained open and that a negotiated pause was theoretically possible. That fiction was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. In a conflict that loses the fiction of limited war tends to find the reality of something much larger. There's a concept in crisis management called the stability-instability paradox. It describes a situation in which the existence of extreme escalation risk, the potential for a conflict to spiral into a catastrophic exchange, actually enables lower-level violence by making full escalation seem impossible to either party. Both parties know the conflict cannot escalate to its ultimate expression. Therefore, both parties feel freer to push at lower levels. The paradox is that this calculation is only stable as long as both parties correctly assess the other's tolerance for escalation. When that assessment fails, when one party miscalculates how far the other is willing to go, the paradox collapses. Pakistan and Afghanistan entered the stability instability. Paradox in full during the autumn of 2025, the incident that pushed the crisis toward its most dangerous threshold did not begin as a Pakistani Operation. It began as a TTP attack, a convoy of Pakistani army vehicles on a resupply route in North Waziristan was struck by a complex ambush, IED, followed by direct fire from multiple positions. A tactical signature that indicated not improvised insurgent action but trained, coordinated, well-resourced military planning. 14 Pakistani soldiers were killed. 11 were wounded. 1 vehicle was destroyed and 2 were disabled. Pakistani intelligence, working through SIGINT intercepts and human sources within 72 hours, traced the operational planning for this ambush to a specific Taliban military compound in Paktika, a facility that Pakistani analysis assessed as having provided the weapons, the communication coordination, and the cross-border movement facilitation that made the ambush possible. This was a different kind of intelligence assessment from the previous target packages. This was not a probability estimate about infrastructure that might be used for TTP purposes. This was a direct, time-sensitive linkage between a Taliban military installation and the killing of Pakistani soldiers. The target package went to the Chief of Army Staff. The authorization came back within hours. The Pakistani strike on the Paktika Taliban compound was, by any operational measure, exceptionally precise. 4 JF-17 aircraft, operating from a Pakistani airbase, approached from Pakistani airspace at altitude and released precision-guided munitions on pre-surveilled coordinates. The compound was destroyed. Pakistani battle damage assessment confirmed the destruction of the physical structure and, based on post-strike imagery and subsequent HUMINT, the killing of several Taliban military personnel. It was, from a purely tactical perspective, a competent and effectively executed strike. It was also the most consequential Pakistani military action since the crisis began, because it was not, by any available intelligence assessment, a TTP strike. It was a Pakistani strike on Taliban military forces. The operational fiction was over. The Taliban's response was immediate and formally military in character. For the first time, Taliban forces along the Kunar and Paktika frontages fired artillery and rockets at Pakistani frontier positions, not TTP fighters, not deniable proxies. Taliban military units operating under Taliban military command, engaging Pakistani military targets with direct fire across the Durand Line. Pakistani frontier positions returned fire for approximately 4 hours on a day in late autumn 2025. Pakistani and Taliban military forces were in direct, acknowledged, reciprocal combat. 4 hours, enough time for every intelligence agency in the region, EC, RAW, the CIA, MI6, Iranian intelligence, Chinese MSS, to reach the same urgent conclusion simultaneously and reach for telephones, because the two parties who had just begun shooting at each other across a 2,670-kilometer frontier shared a deeply uncomfortable nuclear dimension that no one in any regional or global capital wanted to see. Activated. Pakistan is a nuclear weapon state. Its nuclear doctrine, full-spectrum deterrence, involves tactical nuclear weapons as well as strategic ones. And Pakistan has been explicit that its nuclear threshold is not limited to existential threats to Pakistan's territorial integrity. Pakistan's nuclear calculus has historically been framed around the Indian threat, but the institutional logic of nuclear deterrence does not permit clean compartmentalization. Afghanistan is not a nuclear state. The Taliban have no nuclear capability, but the chain of events that a Pakistani-Taliban direct military confrontation could set in motion, Taliban drawing on Pakistani domestic Pashtun political networks, Pakistan potentially using additional regional actors against Afghanistan, the possibility of Pakistani military operations expanding to a scale that brought Chinese strategic interests directly into the calculation, created a crisis geometry that went well beyond the military dimensions of the immediate engagement. In Beijing, the MSS was on the phone to both Rawalpindi and Kabul within hours of the exchange of fire. In Washington, an administration that had carefully managed its distance from the Pakistani TP conflict was recalculating its position. In Moscow, the specific character of the calculations can only be inferred. The 4-hour direct military exchange ended not through the initiative of either combatant, but through the simultaneous application of external pressure at a scale that neither Rawalpindi nor Kabul could ignore. Chinese diplomatic intervention was decisive. China's relationship with Pakistan, built through CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and decades of strategic partnership, gave Beijing leverage in Rawalpindi that no other external actor possessed. China's relationship with the Taliban, established through economic engagement and the Taliban's formal commitment to deny Chinese Uyghur separatists sanctuary in Afghanistan, gave Beijing leverage in Kabul that equally no other actor possessed. The Chinese position was direct, transmitted without diplomatic ambiguity to both capitals. This escalation must stop. Its continuation threatened Chinese investments in Pakistani infrastructure, Chinese strategic interests in regional stability, and Chinese influence over both parties that had been painstakingly built and that Beijing had no intention of sacrificing to a conflict whose proximate cause was a terrorist organization. Neither party fully controlled the ceasefire that emerged from Chinese mediation over the following 72 hours was not a peace agreement. It was a pause, a tactical deconfliction, operationally precise. Pakistani strikes would suspend for a defined period. Taliban military forces would withdraw from forward positions to pre-crisis baselines. Both parties would engage in back-channel diplomatic contact through Chinese facilitation. The ceasefire was a resolution of any of the underlying issues. The TTP was still in Afghanistan. The Taliban were still refusing to suppress it. The Durand Line was still contested, and 14 Pakistani soldiers were still dead. In Islamabad, the Prime Minister convened a National Security Committee session that ran, according to sources who spoke to Pakistani journalists, for 11 hours. The session's central question was not whether to resume strikes. Both civilian and military members of the committee understood that resumption was probably inevitable, given the domestic political cost of appearing to capitulate under Taliban pressure. The central question was something more fundamental and more difficult. What does winning look like? If the campaign's objective was to eliminate the TTP threat to Pakistan, what was the military endpoint that corresponded to that objective? How would Pakistan know it had been achieved? What was the condition on the Afghan side? What Taliban behavior? What organizational degradation of the TTP? What structural change in the sanctuary relationship? That would allow Pakistan to declare its objective met and its campaign concluded. The discussion that followed this question, according to the same sources, was among the most uncomfortable in the committee's recent memory. Because nobody in that room could answer it cleanly. The TTP could not be bombed into non-existence from Afghan territory without either a ground campaign of a scale that Pakistan's military judged operationally prohibitive or a Taliban government decision to suppress the TTP that no evidence suggested was forthcoming. The Taliban government could not be coerced into suppressing the TTP by airstrikes that were simultaneously generating Afghan civilian casualties, hardening Afghan public opinion against Pakistan, and providing the Taliban with an international legitimacy narrative that it had been unable to generate through governance alone. Pakistan could sustain the strikes indefinitely, but sustaining them indefinitely while achieving neither the elimination of the TTP nor the behavioral change from the Taliban was not a strategy. It was an indefinitely prolonged expenditure of military capability, political capital, and human life in service of an objective that the current approach could not reach. 11 hours. The committee emerged with a decision that was, in the unsentimental vocabulary of strategic analysis, a decision to continue without resolution, because The alternative acknowledgement that the campaign's theory of victory was flawed carried domestic political costs that no government in Pakistan's history had proved willing to absorb. A war that cannot be won, cannot be lost, and cannot be stopped is not an anomaly in the 21st century. It is its defining feature. The Pakistani strikes on Afghanistan in 2025 did not end. They modulated. They intensified and paused and intensified again, shaped by the Chinese-mediated ceasefire framework that provided structured breathing space while resolving nothing. Strike cycles were shorter and the intervals between them longer. Target sets were reviewed and revised with the chastened precision of planners who had learned, at genuine cost, the difference between intelligence confidence and ground truth. Civilian casualty mitigation protocols were formalized and in some cases improved. The TTP was degraded, measurably, demonstrably, specific. High-value targets were eliminated. Specific command nodes were destroyed. The organization's operational tempo inside Pakistan, measured in attack frequency, geographic spread, and tactical complexity, declined in the 90-day windows following major Pakistani strike packages and then reconstituted. Not fully, not immediately, not without cost, but the network's regenerative capacity, drawing on recruitment pipelines fed by tribal grievance, ideological conviction. The Badal obligation created by Pakistani strikes on civilian communities and the organizational shelter provided by Taliban territory proved more robust than Pakistani campaign planning had assumed. By early 2026, Pakistani security analysts were publishing assessments that described the TTP not as a broken organization, but as a stressed one, operationally constrained, leadership disrupted, logistically pressured, but institutionally intact and strategically persistent. This is not failure. It is also not success. It is the condition that modern counterterrorism produces when it is applied without a complementary political strategy, sustained management of a threat that persists below its former peak, consuming resources and generating costs. Indefinitely, the Taliban's institutional position in this aftermath was both strengthened and complicated in ways that may take years to fully resolve. Strengthened because the Pakistani strikes and the Taliban's visible resistance to them, partial, calibrated, diplomatically managed but publicly displayed, gave the Taliban government a nationalist legitimacy narrative that no amount of governance competence could have generated. Defending Afghan soil against Pakistani aggression was, in the political culture of the tribal belt and the broader Afghan national consciousness, exactly the kind of state behavior that produces popular legitimacy. The Taliban had inadvertently been given a gift by Pakistan, complicated, because the crisis had exposed the limits of Taliban's strategic flexibility. The IEA government had been trying to manage its international isolation, pursuing trade relationships, seeking sanctions relief, engaging diplomatically with regional neighbors in ways that required demonstrating a minimum of state-like behavior. The Pakistani crisis forced the Taliban to prioritize solidarity with the TTP over the gradual normalization process, a prioritization that some Taliban pragmatists in the foreign ministry and the intelligence apparatus understood was strategically costly even as they could not politically avoid it. The Taliban remained in power, but their path to international recognition, always narrow, always conditional, had been further compressed by a crisis that reminded the world and reminded Kabul of the fundamental incompatibility between harboring a designated terrorist organization and seeking international legitimacy. The civilian toll of this conflict remains and will remain the most enduring moral and strategic fact of what Pakistan did in Afghanistan in 2025. The precise number of civilians killed in Pakistani strikes will likely never be definitively established. Afghan authorities, Pakistani military authorities, UN monitors, and independent journalists produced widely varying estimates throughout the conflict, shaped by access limitations, methodological differences, and in some cases, deliberate manipulation by parties with interests in specific narratives. What is not in dispute is that civilians died in Pakistani strikes, families, children, People whose relationship to the TTP was, at most, geographic. They lived in the same terrain that the TTP used, in the same villages, sometimes in compounds that shared walls with TTP-affiliated infrastructure, sometimes simply in the wrong place on the night that a target package was authorized. These deaths are not erased by Pakistan's genuine security interests. They are not made acceptable by the reality of TTP violence against Pakistani civilians. They are not rendered strategically irrelevant by the legal framework of proportionality, under which Pakistani military planners justified their targeting decisions. They are simply deaths, permanent, generative, each one a seed in soil that has been growing exactly this kind of harvest for 40 years. The broader regional architecture of the crisis left specific legacies in several dimensions. For Pakistan, the campaign accelerated a reckoning with a strategic question that Pakistani grand strategy had deferred for decades. What is Pakistan's fundamental relationship with political Islam as an instrument of foreign policy? The Taliban, the TTP, the Haqqani network, the broader ecosystem of Pakistani-affiliated jihadist organizations had been tools of Pakistani strategic design. They had also, with historical consistency, turned against the state that created them. The campaign in Afghanistan in 2025 did not resolve this question, but it made the deferral of the question operationally and politically more costly than at any previous moment. For Afghanistan, the crisis consolidated a specific geopolitical identity that the Taliban may not have chosen but cannot escape: an isolated, internally fractured state governed by an organization that the international community will not recognize, surrounded by neighbors who regard its domestic governance as a security threat, and dependent on the Chinese-managed regional order for even the minimal engagement that prevents complete economic collapse. For China, the crisis demonstrated both the value and the limits of the regional influence. Beijing has been building through CPEC and diplomatic engagement. Beijing's ability to stop the 4-hour direct military exchange was a genuine display of leverage, the kind of crisis management capacity that transforms a regional economic investor into a de facto security guarantor. But the persistence of the underlying conditions, TTP sanctuary, Pakistani domestic political pressure, Taliban governance paralysis, demonstrated that leverage can pause a crisis. It cannot resolve one whose roots are deeper than any external actor's influence. For the United States, which watched from a calculated distance, the crisis contained uncomfortable implications about the long-term consequences of the 2021 withdrawal. The American argument had been that Afghan security was an Afghan responsibility and that Pakistan could manage its own frontier. The 2025 crisis did not refute this argument, but it demonstrated with painful specificity the gap between that argument's logic and the region's actual condition. What does the Durand Line look like from a decade's distance? It looks like what it always was, not a border but a compression zone, a place where historical grievance, tribal identity, state weakness, ideological extremism, and great power competition were pressed together by colonial cartography and held in unstable suspension by the imperfect institutions of two states that never had the luxury of building themselves without external interference. Pakistan's strikes in 2025 did not redraw that line. They did not resolve the TTP. They did not transform the Taliban. They did not end the insurgency or create the conditions for a political settlement. What they did was demonstrate, with the irreducible clarity of lived experience, that military force applied to a problem rooted in politics, ideology, and identity is not a solution. It is a statement, an expensive, lethal, politically complex statement that communicates resolve without establishing the conditions for resolution. Pakistan said, "We will not accept this." Afghanistan said, "You cannot stop it." Both statements were true. Neither truth contained an exit, and so we returned to where we began, a map. Two governments. A line drawn in ink that has never had the decency to behave like a border. The Pakistani Prime Minister used the word crush. History's response to that word, when directed at networks embedded in populations, sustained by ideology, and sheltered by terrain that has outlasted every army that ever tried to hold it, has been consistent across centuries. The network absorbs, the network adapts. The network reconstitutes, and the state that tried to crush it looks at its own expenditure, the aircraft sorties, the missile costs, the soldiers' funerals, the diplomatic capital spent, the civilian deaths that fed tomorrow's recruiters, and asks the question that every military campaign eventually produces: was this the shape of victory? Or was this the shape of a problem finding its next form? There is no final battle in this story. There is no decisive engagement that settles the account. There is only the continued recalculation of a region that has been recalculating itself for longer than most modern states have existed, in which the latest equation, Pakistan, strikes. The Taliban's response, the TTP's persistence, China's mediation is simply the current iteration of a calculation that will produce another iteration, and another after that in the same terrain, with different names and different weapons and the same underlying logic. The Durand Line will be there when all of this is settled. It will be there when the next crisis begins. History does not repeat. It recalculates. This particular calculation, the intersection of state-sponsored ideology turned inward, of proxy architecture that weaponized its patron, of a border that has never had consent, is among the most intricate and consequential strategic problems of our time. It demands rigorous analysis. It demands the kind of thinking that resists simplification, that insists on following the geometry of cause and consequence wherever it leads, that treats strategy not as a set of tools but as a discipline of mind. If that is the kind of thinking you brought to this story, you are already operating at the level that War Atelier was built for. The atelier remains open. The next campaign is already being drawn.